Let's do a thought experiment together. Here's the question. What are the odds that you will be murdered? Wouldn't that be a great icebreaker for your next dinner party? I can hardly wait. I'll give you my number. But seriously, what are the chances that those awful homicides we read about in the newspaper or watch on television will come home to roost so that you become a murder statistic? As chairman of a nonprofit group called the Murder Accountability Project, I can tell you that your odds of being murdered are heavily influenced by who you are and by where you live. Here in the United States, the FBI tells us that last year there were at least 16,200 Americans who were murdered. The Census Bureau tells us our population was slightly more than 327 million. That works out to an annual homicide rate of nearly 5 murdered Americans for every 100,000 people. That's how this statistic usually gets reported. Doesn't sound so bad, does it? But that's the wrong way to estimate the threat that murder represents. Why? Because it expresses a murder rate in terms of a single year. I want to live more than 1 year. I bet you do too. So in the United States, our life expectancy is calculated to be slightly more than 78 years. Here are the 2 formulas we'll need to calculate our lifetime odds of being murdered. First, we need to know the annual rate, which is taken by the number of homicides divided by the population. Then to figure our lifetime odds, we take the number 1 and divide it by the product of the annual homicide rate times our life expectancy. Applying the values that we now know for the United States, we can calculate what our collective national odds of being murdered are. And it works out to 1 out of 257. 1 in 257 doesn't sound so good, does it? Now, we've had to make some assumptions for this calculation. We had to assume that you were born today, that you will live your whole life in the United States, and you'll see in a few minutes that's a big one, that you will live to a normal life expectancy of 78 years, and that the current homicide rate does not change. With those assumptions, we know that our collective national odds of being murdered are 1 in 257. But let's not think about a national average. What are your odds living here in Jacksonville? The Jacksonville Police Department reported to the FBI that last year there were 110 homicides. The Census Bureau tells us that your population was slightly less than 904,000 people. That works out to a homicide rate of slightly more than 12 murders per 100,000 population. Plugging those values into the formula, we can now know that your lifetime odds of being murdered are 1 in 105. Holy cow. 1 in 105 would be wonderful odds if you were playing the Powerball. But this is a lottery nobody wants to win. Now, I don't know if this will make you feel better. My odds of being murdered are less. I live in Fairfax County, Virginia, just across the Potomac River from Washington, D.C., where in recent years we've been averaging about 20 murders a year, despite having a population of 1.1 million. That means you are 7 times more likely to be murdered than I am. Cheer up, Jacksonville. You're doing way better than dozens and dozens of other major American cities. Take a look. Again, these are wonderful odds if you were playing lotto, but unfortunately, they express the rate at which people in Baltimore, Chicago, New Orleans, and St. Louis are being murdered. Now, this is hard to believe, but the Murder Accountability Project is not in business to scare you. We're nerds. We're statisticians who want to save lives. We hope to empower you to save your own lives. We have a mantra at our group that I would love you to remember. It doesn't have to be this way. We on the board of directors say that to each other all the time. It doesn't have to be this way. When you think about it, that's a pretty good mantra for most TED Talks. Please say it with me. It doesn't have to be this way. You're starting to make me believe. How do we know this is true? Because it isn't this way in big hunks of the world. Consider Canada. Canadian police recently reported an annual total of 660 murders, which happens to be the exact same number the Chicago Police Department reported alone. Now, the math is a little different in Canada because Canadians have a life expectancy that's 4 years longer than ours. Part of the reason for their improved longevity is their exceptionally low homicide rate. The odds that a Canadian will be murdered are about 1 in 700. And it isn't this way in almost all Western industrialized nations. Take a look. Wouldn't you be glad to trade your odds for any of the national odds of these Western countries? A few years ago, I had lunch with the senior homicide supervisor for the nation of Denmark. We were attending the annual meeting of the International Homicide Investigators Association. So I asked him, in Denmark, how many murders do you have a year? Oh, he said, about 50. 50. I followed on. Well, how many of those do you solve by arresting killers? I asked. And he looked me right in the eye and said, oh, about 49. And I almost dropped my salad fork. He was matter-of-factly reporting a 98% clearance rate. Hamlet was wrong. There's nothing rotten in the state of Denmark. And those other Western countries I just showed you, they are clearing murders at a much higher rate than here in the United States. So what is happening here? What we've been told through television crime shows and Hollywood movies is, well, not true. Murders do not get solved in 60 minutes by beautiful people standing in front of gigantic computer monitors in sparkling high-tech squad rooms. In fact, in a growing number of cities, most murders don't get solved at all. Despite the advances with computers, DNA, and other forensic technology, we are less likely to solve a murder today than we were 50 years ago. And I mean a lot less. Let me show you a very disturbing chart. This is from the FBI. It shows the percentage of homicides year by year that were cleared because the killer was arrested. In the mid-1960s, we were making an arrest about 90% of the time. In recent years, we've been making arrests about 60 or 62% of the time. In fact, 2 years ago, we hit an all-time low, a national homicide clearance rate of 59%. What's happening in Jacksonville? According to the data the Jacksonville Police Department gave to the FBI, you are doing a little worse than average. You're clearing about 56% of your murders. Again, cheer up. There are dozens of cities that are doing much, much worse. Do you remember those cities with frighteningly high odds? Baltimore, Chicago, New Orleans, and St. Louis? For many years, most murders go unsolved in those countries. Most of the time, killers are still walking the street. Bad things happen when killers are allowed to get away with their crimes. Why should you care? What does it matter if murderers are more likely to get away with their crimes now than ever before? We've found that city by city, the rate of murder tends to rise when the rate at which homicides are cleared through arrest decline. In statistics, we call this an inverse relationship. When a city allows the percentage of murders cleared through arrest to drop, the rate of murder rises. That means you and me and everyone else start dying more than we used to die. But don't take my word for it. Look at the data. We've taken all of the nation's police departments that report at least 10 murders a year, and we've divided them into 4 evenly sized groups called quartiles, according to how often they arrest killers. We then calculated the aggregate rate at which murder occurs in each quartile. Let's pay attention to this chart, because tens of thousands of Americans died to provide the data that shows us this very disturbing pattern. You are 2.5 times more likely to be killed if you live in a city where most murders go unsolved than if you live in a city that's performing ahead of the curve. You are 2.5 times more likely to be murdered. And we've also found that the 50% clearance rate level is a kind of tipping point. When a city allows a clearance rate to fall below 50%, the rate of murder rises alarmingly. What's happening in Jacksonville? Well, again, you're clearing about 56% of your murders. If you allow that percent to drop just a little bit more, you, like dozens and dozens of other major cities, will be approaching that tipping point. This brings us to our other mantra. Solving murders saves lives. It makes sense, doesn't it? If most of the time we allow killers to walk the street, then lots of bad things happen. In places like Baltimore, Chicago, New Orleans, and St. Louis, we can expect the rate of murder to rise, and boy, did it rise. Killers walking the street are available to kill again. Why not? It worked the first time. It might be cool to tell your friends you are now a serial killer. Killers walking the street are a living, breathing testament that there is no sanction to murder, so they inspire others. And one more thing, as the number of unsolved murders pile up, folks start to believe the only way to get justice is to take the law into their own hands. Murder begets murder, especially unsolved murder. What can you do? Well, let me tell you a little about the Murder Accountability Project. We're a tiny organization. We try to combat homicide with information. You can come to our website at murderdata.org. That's murderdata.org. And you can look up the number of homicides and the homicide clearance rate for your hometown. We have case files on more than 772,000 murders, including 28,000 cases that should have been reported to the FBI but weren't. We obtained those records using the Freedom of Information Act. If you've ever lost someone to homicide, come and you can probably find their record at our website. So come, take a look at how often murders are cleared through arrest in your town. If you don't like what you see, don't keep that information to yourself. Tell people. Tell your family, your friends, your neighbors. Better yet, call your mayor, your city council member, and your neighborhood association president. They exist for a reason, to listen to you. And if they're not listening, don't worry about it. They won't have that job for long. Your job, my job, our job is just to keep talking and get others to talk with us. Something that we found: when politicians make solving murder a priority, conditions usually get better. Lives usually get saved. And something else we found: everyday people like you and like me can make a difference. For 3 years now, the Murder Accountability Project has been warning that there are too many unsolved murders of women who were strangled and asphyxiated on Chicago's south and west sides. We found 51 unsolved murders of women who died the same way, their bodies scattered in trash cans, abandoned buildings, and empty alleyways. These were mostly sexual murders involving women with histories of prostitution and drug use. Despite our warning and despite stories on television and in the newspaper, nothing much was happening. Until a lovely lady named Beverly Reed Scott started a personal campaign. She organized community meetings in which the names of these 51 women were read out loud. She actually calculated the ward in which every woman died, and then she called members of the city council to tell them someone was out there slaughtering their constituents. That's when the Chicago Police Department ordered a special review with the FBI, taking a hard look at these 51 unsolved murders. We don't know if any good will come of this review, but we do know that Beverly made something happen. How? Because one woman realized the truth. And what is the truth, Jacksonville? It doesn't have to be this way. Because why? Solving murders saves lives. Thank you.